So I'm now recording, by the way. I have to do it early so I remember. If you're not comfortable with your face being shown on the screen, you can turn your cameras off and still participate. If you look at the chat dialogue underneath your screens, there's a chat button. You will be able to download a copy of the source sheet, but I'll also be sharing it with you so that you'll be able to follow along and see it on your screens. And what else? And if you'd like to ask questions or make some comments, you can do so using the chat function. And I'll also stay on for a little bit after 11 o'clock if anyone has some further questions or discussions that they wish to entertain or they wish to respond to. That's all fine with me. It worked out pretty well last week. So shall we jump in? I will turn everyone on mute, but I will need some readers today. So be on standby. You might be called, but it's okay to say you're not comfortable if you're not. But I might call on you to help me with some of the sources that we'll be reviewing today. Before we do that, I'd like to just do a quick review of what we covered last week. This class is called Holy Jerusalem. And we've been exploring the question, where does Jerusalem's holiness come from? What is the nature of its special status? We looked at early sources in the Torah, not all of them, but some of them. And it seems that in the Bible itself, there is a very tangible kind of respect for the idea that at that place in Jerusalem, God's presence is manifest in a way that is stronger than other places. What that means, sort of metaphysically, I don't know how to explain it to you. I try to convey how I think about it in my own mind as sort of a collection of molecules. If God is everywhere and all the molecules in the world represent God, then there's a higher concentration of those molecules on the Temple Mount. It seems that through time, the idea in the Bible that God was present in that place grew or changed in a way so as to think of God's presence not being dependent on the sacrifices, not in the temple itself, but in the actual place, in the stones, in the earth. And we saw that very clearly in Midrash Tanhuma, the third source, where Jerusalem was thought of as the center of the world, the place where God created all of existence from there. And there were some other, some of you have maybe heard some other stories about why the Temple Mount is sacred. There are some traditions that say that that's the spot where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. There are some traditions that say that that is the very place where Solomon built the first temple, right? That exact place where the Golden Dome sits is where Solomon built the temple. I don't know, there are archaeologists that dispute some of these points here or there, but as a rabbi, I'm here to sort of explain the rabbinic point of view, the sources that give that place its holiness, its meaning. And there's no question, I think, that in the Bible, the ground itself of the Temple Mount is holy. We looked at some sources then in the Talmud that challenge whether it's such a good idea that we infuse a physical place with holiness. If you remember, we looked at sources that I called holiness scandals. And these holiness scandals are found both in Jewish and in early Christian literature when they speak of what happened at the temple, particularly when the Second Temple was around, what happened to the priesthood, how it became corrupt, how there was murder in the priesthood, how there was bribery in the priesthood, how there was injustice at the priesthood. All of these stories, there are many of them, and I just selected two to review with you last week, where it seemed that the rabbis were almost mocking the idea that God was found in a place, and certainly they were fearful of that notion because of what it could lead to. It leads to a religion where people are vying for proximity to holiness and are not worried about their own actions, their own behavior, their own observance. The rabbis are much more concerned about people's observance than they are about how close you are to a physical location. And by the way, this is a theme that goes back to the days of the Second Temple. I was saying we have sources that date to the Pharisaic period, right? When the Second Temple was around, where the rabbis were mocking the corruption of the priesthood and this idea that the closer you were to that mount, the more holy you were, even if you lived a life that was corrupt and that was unjust in every way. That's the rabbinic transformation of Jerusalem to more of a symbol and less of a, what's the right word? Less of a spiritual force, less of a spiritual center. Then we looked at Maimonides. We looked at the first source of Maimonides, and we're going to look at the second presentation from Maimonides today. Maimonides does something that I thought was fascinating. Even though the rabbinic tradition, as I explained, stayed away from this notion that Jerusalem was a holy place and was very afraid of that, Maimonides seems to affirm that the Temple Mount retains holy status. And he says, if you wanted to go up there and sacrifice, make an offering to God today, you could do it, because it is not the physical presence of the temple or an altar that makes that place holy. It's the earth itself, the ground itself, the place itself. And so anyone who goes up to that mount in a state of impurity is liable for, as you saw in that source, the first source on Maimonides, what's going to happen? Karet in Hebrew, excision, excommunication. You're in big trouble if you try and head up to the Temple Mount. And you know, by the way, that even today, there are some who say you cannot walk on the Temple Mount. You can't go up there. A Jew cannot go up to the Temple Mount, even if a Jew was able to, because it's a place that requires purity. And what do we need in order to become pure? We need, the ritual with the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer. Well, there's no red heifers that I know of, so no Jew can go up to the Temple Mount. So we have a problem. And I commented last week that it was so odd that Maimonides, who is not much of a mystic, he's a rationalist, that he would affirm the holy status of the Temple Mount. But what I think, and what others think, is that Maimonides was trying to restrict, using his logic, he was trying to restrict access for the purpose of for the purpose of protecting the Temple Mount from fetishization, for the purpose of protecting Judaism from becoming a religion that focuses on holy place instead of holy action. So we're going to see that again, I think, in this second source of Maimonides, how he rewrites one of the passages of the Talmud that focuses on the Temple Mount and its sacred status. He rewrites it, I think, in a way that, let's say, lowers the status of, lowers the sacred status of Jerusalem, but in an odd sort of way. So one of the features that I think we know about the Temple Mount in Jewish life today, if I was to ask you, what is the relevance of the Temple Mount in Jewish life today? Well, some of you might say, well, there's the Western Wall. We go to the Western Wall, and that's a sacred place. But the other way that the Temple Mount is relevant in Jewish life today is that it is the focus of our prayers, right? You remember the big debate at Holy Blossom, or the ongoing debate at Holy Blossom. Where is the direction of prayer? This was a scandal 10, 20 years ago. Should they redo the sanctuary so that the prayers of the congregation, when they pray the Amidah, so that the congregation is facing Jerusalem? But it's really facing the Temple Mount, right? It is the place where all of the prayers recited anywhere in the world have to face Jerusalem. This isn't the first time, I hope. Give me a thumbs up if it's not the first time that you've heard such a thing. Good. Okay, so where does that come from? I'm going to show you today the source in the Talmud. Let's first look at the source in the Talmud that explains where that idea comes from, that all of our prayers should face Jerusalem. Who am I gonna pick on? Yehuda, are you okay to read? I can't hear you, but I don't think are you okay to read, Yehuda? Yes or no? Thumbs up from that. Okay, that's a thumbs. That's a thumbs down. Toby, are you okay to read?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to read from the bottom of this page. This is from the Talmud, where the source comes from that advocates for prayers facing the Temple Mount.
The sages taught in a Tosefta, a blind person and one who is unable to approximate the directions and therefore is unable to face Jerusalem in order to pray, may focus his heart towards his Father in heaven, as it is stated, and they shall pray to the Lord.
And they shall pray to the Lord, exactly. So remember, as you read, our volunteers, I'm going to interrupt you, so don't be offended. The first thing the Talmud says, it takes for granted that everyone knows that there's a direction to which we all pray. But it starts off saying, if you're blind and you don't know where north, south, east, or west is, you focus your heart towards your Father in heaven. Everyone understand that? What does that mean? You focus your heart towards your Father in heaven? Well, you have some intention in your mind that I am praying to God. Focus your heart towards your Father in heaven. Okay, go ahead, Toby.
One who was standing in prayer in the diaspora should focus his heart towards Eretz Yisrael, as it is stated, and they shall pray to you by way of their land, which you have given to their fathers.
Okay, so if you're standing in Moldova, you pray towards Israel. Everyone prays towards the land of Israel. Now, what do I do if I'm in Israel? Go ahead, Toby.
One who was standing in it, is that it? One who was standing in Eretz Yisrael. I can't get it now somehow. I'm sorry, I can't get it now. Oh, the words, yeah, here. I can't get it now. Oh, here
One
it is.
who is standing in Eretz Yisrael should focus his heart towards Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. And they shall pray to the Lord by way of the city that you have chosen.
So you see what the Talmud is doing? It's citing a verse for every claim. And you could almost think of concentric circles, right? We're getting closer and closer and closer. Here we are in the diaspora. We face Israel. Now, what do we do when we're in Israel? We face Jerusalem. Next. Now, what if I'm in Jerusalem?
One who was standing in Jerusalem should focus his heart toward the temple, as it is stated, and they shall pray towards this house.
Excellent.
One who is standing in the temple should focus his heart toward the Holy of Holies, as it is stated, and they shall pray towards this place. One who is standing in the Holy of Holies should focus his heart toward the seat of the ark cover, atop the ark, the dwelling place of God's glory. One who is standing behind the seat of the ark cover should visualize himself as if standing before the ark cover and turn toward it. Consequently, one standing in prayer in the east turns to face west, and one standing in the west turns to face east. One standing in the south turns to face north, and one standing in the north turns to face south. All of the people of Israel find themselves focusing their hearts towards one place, the Holy of Holies in the temple.
So you see, go ahead. You can finish, Toby.
An allusion to this is found in what Rabbi Avin and some say Rabbi Avina said. What verse alludes to this? Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with turrets. 1,000 shields hang from it, all of the armor of the mighty. He interprets the word talpiot as the hill toward which all mouths turn.
So the word, very good. So this word talpiot, Rabbi Avin said that means tel piyut. What is a piyut? He's very smart in this interpretation. Thank you very much, Toby. Piyut is prayer. And what is tel? For those of you who know Tel Aviv, right? Tel Aviv is the city. So Jerusalem is Tel Piyot, the city where all the piyut, all the prayer gathers from everywhere in the world. And remember, the rabbinic idea is that Jerusalem is there in the center of the world. So if you're in the south, you pray north. If you're in the east, you pray west. Everything gathers around the Holy of Holies. I want everyone to notice two things about this source because it's going to be important when we look at how Maimonides rewrites this section of the Talmud. First of all, the repetition of these words, should focus his heart, should focus his heart, should focus his heart. The Hebrew is yechavein et libo. It repeats over and over and over again. Now, what's interesting is that doesn't mean, what I think we expect this to say is turns his body physically towards Jerusalem, right? Like I introduced this with the example from Holy Blossom. At Holy Blossom, the argument wasn't where people's hearts should be turned to. It was where they should physically be facing. So notice that the Talmud does not say physically face until the end. It says should turn to face west, but most of the phrases say should focus his heart, yechavein et libo, right? And the other thing I want you to notice about this is the clear sort of increasing, it starts out, this section of the Talmud, with the blind person. In other words, the one who is the most distant from the Holy of Holies is the one who is blind or who cannot perceive direction. That person in this Talmudic source is sort of lost. And the best that he or she can do is to think about God, right? But then the concentric circles, right? They get closer and closer and closer and closer until we end up in the Holy of Holies, where you think, that person is the closest to God. Now remember what Maimonides, I'm going to prejudice you before we look at his source, but remember what we already learned about Maimonides. He doesn't like people being close to the Temple Mount, and yet he has to be he has to be loyal. He has to be true to the sources in the Talmud. So remember, in his Mishnah Torah, which is his magnum opus, right, Maimonides, he rewrites the important laws and ideas in the Talmud. He rewrites them in more simple language. So given that, I'd like us to look at what Maimonides does with this source. How does Maimonides, and you can already see, look on your screens, how short it is. He doesn't feel the need to insert all of the verses from the Bible that the Talmud inserts, but take a look at how he writes or rewrites the source in the Talmud. Marcy, would you be able to read for us?
With face turned towards the temple, anyone outside Palestine turns his face towards the land of Israel and recites the prayer.
So now look at the difference in the language. The Talmud says, Yechavein et libo, should focus his heart. What is Maimonides saying? Look at, for those of you who know Hebrew, Machazir panav. That's different. That's not kavanah. That's not focusing on a certain place. That is that earlier example. That's that direction of prayer. That's a physical direction. For Maimonides, the statement in the Talmud about where you focus your heart is not meant to be interpreted spiritually. It is a physical instruction for where a person should turn to in the midst of their prayers. And Maimonides starts off not with the blind person, notice that, we're going to get back to that, but to the one outside of Israel, and that person has to physically turn his face towards the land of Israel and pray. Keep going, Marcy.
One who is in the Holy Land turns toward Jerusalem. One who is in Jerusalem turns towards the temple. If one is in the temple, he turns toward the Holy of Holies. A person who is either blind or unable to determine the right direction or is on a ship directs his heart to the divine presence and prays.
Directs his heart. Now he uses the word Yechavein et libo, turns his heart to the divine presence and praise. Now there's two things I want, thank you, Marcy. There's two things I want everyone to notice about this. First of all, that what I said earlier about Maimonides insisting that this is a passage about where you physically turn to for your prayers. What has he done to the Temple Mount? He has given it a special status, that it is the place where everyone's bodies must be turned to when they pray. We turn towards that direction. The other thing he does is he takes the blind person or the one who can't determine the right direction, and instead of them leading the sugya, leading the passage, remember in the Talmud, leading the passage seems to suggest that the blind person is the most distant, the one who is furthest away. The best that person can do is just think of God. But where does Maimonides put that guy, the blind person? He's not the first one mentioned in this passage. He is the last one mentioned. almost as if he is the center of, and at the center of holiness in this revision of the Talmudic text. Now, maybe, all of this is just a suggestion, but maybe for Maimonides, the ideal is not about where you're praying, the direction where you're praying. But this blind person represents that sort of ideal. For the blind person's kavanah is what all of us should aspire to. He starts off saying, yeah, Jerusalem is important, and we should always face Jerusalem. But where should our kavanah be? In the Talmud, our kavanah, when I say kavanah, do you all understand? Kavanah means like where my mental intention is. In the Talmud, my mental intention should be on all of these physical places. My mental attention, what should I be thinking about when I'm praying? I should be thinking about Jerusalem. I should, if I'm in Jerusalem, I should be thinking about the temple. Not for Maimonides. That's not what I should be thinking about. He says, no, just face Jerusalem. But what should you be thinking about? The only time he says these words, yechavein et libo, think of this, put your heart towards this intention, he's talking about a person who is blind. Isn't that amazing? The person who is blind is the one we all, perhaps, should aspire to emulate. Because your eyes, if you're using them to pray to God, but you're thinking of a building, you're thinking of a mountain, you're thinking of a cover on top of an ark, that's almost like a graven image. So Maimonides says, emulate that blind person. He's not, nobody cares where he's facing. He doesn't, I shouldn't say nobody cares, but where he's facing is not that important. He is at the center. And why is he at the center? Because yechavenet libo keneged hashechina v'yitpalel. Because his intention is on the Shekhinah, on God, and he prays. This is, in my view, a dramatic and beautiful, I think, revision of the Talmud's discussion, and perfect for a guy like Maimonides who believes that prayer is a replacement for worship at the temple, right? The sacrificial worship at the temple. So he's rewriting the rules of prayer. One might have thought without Maimonides that when I'm praying, I should be thinking about the Holy of Holies. No. I should be facing the Holy of Holies. In other words, Jerusalem is still important symbolically. It's a place where all of our prayers get connected to, but it's not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about God. A person needs to think about God. A person needs to emulate the one who is blind. So if I was to ask you, how do you think Maimonides would define the holiness of Jerusalem versus how the Talmud would define the holiness of Jerusalem? Think about how you would answer that question. I think for Maimonides, the holiness of Jerusalem is much more symbolic than it was even for the rabbis. The rabbis who thought that if you focus on the Temple Mount, that was a way of getting closer to God, that the one who is closest to the Temple Mount is the closest to God. There's something real, metaphysical in that space. Maimonides, I think, backs away from that and says, you know what, pray there. It has historical significance, maybe even some ancient religious significance, but prayer isn't about where you're facing or a building or artifacts. It's about intention and God. That's ideal prayer. So he introduces this next series of sources that you have presented to you, that I presented to you, which form, I think, in medieval and modern thought, all sorts of different ways of understanding the holiness of Jerusalem. So that's what I'd like to review next. Maimonides being maybe the rabbi who does the most to open doors for those who would like to reinterpret what it means for God to dwell on that mountain. And now we're going to look at later rabbis who I think pick up where Maimonides left off and also try and reinterpret what the holiness of Jerusalem means. What does it mean that God dwells at that place? So, who should I pick on? Ike, how about you?
No, I'm not comfortable.
You're not comfortable. Okay, Gordon, how about you? You have to unmute, Gordon. Can you unmute your microphone?
I've done it.
Okay, there you go. Are you okay to read?
I am.
Okay, so this first source we're going to look at is one that I've actually been studying this year. It's from a book called Nefesh HaChaim. Nefesh HaChaim was written by Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. He was the principal student of the Vilna Gaon, the Lithuanian genius. And he is credited with the founding of the famous Volozhin Yeshiva in Lithuania. And so you'll see what his bias is, because he's writing this book to strengthen the idea that real Judaism doesn't come from physical location, but from study, from learning. This is the Lithuanian tradition of yeshiva study. And for him, the development of the intellect, the inner intellect, the inner spirit, is going to be more important than being in a particular place. So Gordon, would you read for us what the Nefesh HaChaim says?
It must be further stated, do not think that my purpose is the making of a physical sanctuary. Know that my entire purpose in explaining the sanctuary and its tools is to hint to you that from these designs you will see and make yourselves, that you might model your actions on the sanctuary and its tools.
So I didn't include everything that the Nefesh HaChaim says about building the sanctuary, but he tries to use the instructions that are found in the Torah, how you build the sanctuary, to derive lessons that are ethical, that apply to human relationships. And you see here his explanation why he does so. He's saying, I'm not describing how the sanctuary is built so that one day you all might build such a sanctuary. For a man like Chaim of Volozhin, the building a physical structure to house God's spirit borders on heresy, because for him, God is all about the intellect, ideas, ethics. So building a house for God, nothing could be more silly to him. Why do we review the laws of the sanctuary? So that from these you might model your actions. What does he mean by that? Go on, Gordon.
You should aim to make all of your actions holy, fitting, and ready to serve as a dwelling place for the Shekhinah.
So all of your actions, in the Hebrew, v'chein ta'asu atem et atzmechem, make yourselves like the temple. Shetihiyu atem b'ma'asechem, so that your deeds will be like the temple. That God would look at me, at you, and say, you know what, if I wanted to hang out with somebody, I would hang out with Rabbi Grover, because everything he does makes me feel welcome and comfortable. We are dwelling places for God when our actions are appropriate for the Shekhinah. When our actions are unethical or unjust, when we do wrong things, then God runs away from us. Keep going.
This is what the Torah means when it says, make me a sanctuary that I may dwell within, that is, within you. All that God has shown with regards to the sanctuary is really meant for the individual.
So excellent. Thank you, Gordon. All that God has shown with regards to the sanctuary is really meant for the individual. The Nefesh HaChaim here rejects the idea that there is anything in the Torah relevant to the construction of the sanctuary that is about architecture, that is about a building plan, that is about a holy building or a holy space. He says, the proof is in that verse that we saw earlier. Make me a sanctuary that I may dwell within, not within that sanctuary. Make yourselves a sanctuary so that I will dwell within you. Where is God to be found for Chaim of Volozhin? Not on a mountain, but in the way we live our lives. Now, some say that Chaim of Volozhin stole this idea from the Hasidim. So, for those of you who have Hasidic background and ancestry, I included some Hasidic sources that seem to suggest similarly that phrase, Asuli Mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, make me a sanctuary that I may dwell within, that phrase hints at the supremacy of the person over any location. So, Norman, would you kindly read for me some of these Hasidic interpretations on holy place?
You shall make me a sanctuary. It says within and not within it, to teach that every person must build a sanctuary in his heart, appropriate for God to dwell within.
This is from Menachem Mendel of Kotz. It says, build me a sanctuary that I may dwell in the Hebrew. For those of you who know the Hebrew, betocham, that's what it says in the verse, within or within them, and velo betocho, and not within it, within that sanctuary. Why does it say that in the verse? To teach that everyone has to build a sanctuary, and not on some mountain, but in his heart, your inner life. Very similar to Chaim of Volozhin, right? One from Lithuania, one from a Litvak, and now from a Chassid, the same idea. Not holy place, holy person. Keep going, Norman.
You shall make me a sanctuary. They asked Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotz to locate God's dwelling place. He answered, in every place where he is welcomed.
Now, this is a very famous Hasidic saying. Where does God dwell? They asked Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotz, his students asked him, and he said, every place where God is welcome. If you make room in your space, whatever that means, for God's Spirit, then that is where God dwells. Menachem Mendel of Kotz didn't say, he dwells. Where does God dwell? Well, on that mountain in Jerusalem. That's not what he answered. In every place where God is welcome. Keep going, Norman.
Thus it is written, make me a sanctuary that I will dwell within. If a person's spirit is full of love of God and fear of God, then God will dwell within him actually.
Right. If you have love and fear of God, the more you become in your own life, the more you emulate the best qualities of faithfulness to God, the more you invite God into your life, and you become the sanctuary where God dwells. And Simone, would you read this last Hasidic source?
You shall make me a sanctuary, make a holy place for my name. Every Jew must welcome the holy into his home.
Now look at this. Sorry to interrupt. Into his home. The place where God dwells is not in Jerusalem. It's not even in your heart. It's in his home. Some of you might be familiar with this idea that a home in Judaism is a Mikdash me'at. It is a place like a mini temple. And if the home is only concerned with the secular, the mundane things, then God doesn't live there. But the commandment, build for me a sanctuary, is not go up to Jerusalem and build a temple or even build one in yourselves. It's turn your home into a sanctuary. Now, why the home? Go ahead, Simone.
It is a person's private life, exemplified by the spirit and atmosphere of his home. That must be filled with holiness. I will dwell within. The home will be my divine sanctuary.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Norman and Simone. So you see here Hasidic sources that I think follow in the path of Maimonides and contribute to the sanctification of that mountain, of that dwelling place for God, using Maimonidean ideas, right? For Maimonides, it's Yechavein et libo. Where is your heart? And reimagining, I think, where God's Spirit can live. It's not just in a temple, not just in a mountain, but you can turn your home into a sanctuary. You can turn yourselves into a sanctuary, and better you focus on that than on some mountain in Jerusalem, which I think that is only preserved according to Hasidic thought, or at least these strands of Hasidic thought, for symbolic reasons only. Okay? As we continue with some other ideas of Jerusalem, I can't ignore the strong connection of Jerusalem to the idea of justice. Jerusalem being the city of justice. If Maimonides tries to preserve Jerusalem as the place where all prayers gather, which is a powerful idea, every Jew, no matter where he or she is in the world, his prayers gather in Jerusalem. Just give me 1 second. I have a crying puppy in the background that I need to silence. Give me 1 second. Okay, thanks. Carmela's over here helping me. There is another idea in several sources, both biblical and medieval, and up until today, that Jerusalem is a city where justice and righteousness, from where righteousness and justice sprout. Probably the earliest source is here in Isaiah. I'll just read it for you. It's short. Do you all see it on the screen? You can give me a thumbs up if you do. Here is what Isaiah says. We're going to read this, by the way. This is the Haftorah, I think, either this Shabbat or next Shabbat. Echa hayta lezona alas, she has become a harlot, the faithful city that was filled with justice, where righteousness dwelt, but now murders. Your silver has turned to dross, your wine is cut with water. your rulers are rogues. Isaiah maybe lays the foundation for this idea that Jerusalem is holy to us, not because of a mountain, not because of God's presence, not because of the presence of sacrifices or a temple, but because we believe that justice as an idea comes from a place, not just from literature, not just from man's divinations, but from a place. Jerusalem represents justice. And in the medieval period, I'll show you this source here. If you look at the book of Genesis, the war that Abraham has with the kings of Jerusalem, they have strange names. Melchizedek, Adoni-Zedek. Some of you who know Genesis might be familiar with these names, but Radak says something here very powerful. He says, Ba'avur Yerushalayim shehu makom tzedek, even before there was an Abraham, Jerusalem was known as a city of justice. Hu makom tzedek. Everyone acknowledged that this was Jerusalem's status, its holy status, and that's what we are preserving when we continue to make Jerusalem the center of our prayers. We are sort of revering the idea of justice. On that same theme, there's a beautiful midrash here that I wanted to share with you. Who have I not asked to read in a while? Fran, would you share with us? From the midrash.
And Abraham called the name of the place Ani Yireh.
Adonai Yireh. So Abraham, this is the place where Abraham sacrificed or didn't sacrifice Isaac. He called the place, which is Mount Moriah, right, the place where the temple is eventually built, Adonai Yireh, God would see. Keep going.
Abraham called it Yireh, as it says, and Abraham called the name of the place Adonai Yireh. Shem called it Shalem, as it says, and Melchizedek, the king of Salem.
So there was a different name from Jerusalem that Shem, remember Shem is one of Noah's sons.
Right.
So Shem called Jerusalem by a different name. He called it Shalem, as it says in the Bible, and Melchizedek, the king of Shalem. So Abraham, the Jew, calls it Adonai Yireh, and Melchizedek, the king calls it Shalem, the same city. The Holy One, keep going, friend.
The Holy One of Blessing said, if I call it Yireh, as Abraham called it, then Shem, who was a righteous man, will become angry. And if I call it Shalem, Abraham, who was a righteous man, will be angry. Instead, I will call it Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, as they called it together, Yireh, Shalem, Yerushalayim.
Isn't that a beautiful source? So the Midrash is saying, thank you, Fran. The Midrash is saying the origin of Jerusalem as a city of justice or equality is not a Jewish idea. It goes back way beyond, it predates Judaism. It goes back to the time of Shem and Avraham, who were good people. And Avraham called it Yireh, and Shem called it Shalem. And God didn't want one side. Isn't this crazy? Because we think today about Jerusalem being, dividing Jerusalem and who owns which part of Jerusalem and which community gets its section. But what does the Midrash say is the origin of Jerusalem? It's the place where everyone lived together in harmony. and that harmony was found even in the name of the city. God didn't want Shem to be jealous and didn't want Abraham to be jealous, so God called it Yerushalayim, a combination of the Jewish name, that's Abraham's name, and the non-Jewish name, the name that that Melchizedek gave to the city. The origin of Jerusalem, what gives it its special status is that it is a city of justice, of equality, of righteousness, where all of the nations are equal. And I want to just, for this last source here, give you a more modern take on that idea. But before we get to that, you have to read some sources from the Bible. So let's read 2 sources from the Bible, and then I'll show you a source from Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, who says that Jerusalem's status as a city of justice is not just an idea that is biblical or pre-biblical. It still must serve as that model today. And that is the source of Jerusalem's holiness. Sarah, would you be able to read for us, Sarah Lakin? Would you be able to read this source in Isaiah? Most of you know this source, but we have to reread it. It'll refresh our minds.
Yes. Let not the foreigner say, "Who has attached himself to the Lord? The Lord will keep me apart from his people." And let not the eunuch say, "I am a withered tree."
So this passage in Isaiah, this is Isaiah 56. Isaiah says, don't think that just because you're a foreigner, this goes very well with the midrash that we just learned, right? Don't think that just because you're a foreigner, that God says you don't have a place in this city. Let not the foreigner say, who has attached himself to the Lord, who is attached to the Lord, meaning a foreigner who is not Jewish, but who lives a good life, follows the ways of Judaism. Let not that person say, the Lord will keep me apart from his people. And let not the eunuch say, I am a withered tree, and there's no hope in my life. For thus says the Lord. Sarah?
As for the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who have chosen what I desire, and holding fast to my covenant, I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons or daughters.
So this is Isaiah, who is speaking when the temple was around, right? He's speaking about the temple in a different way, isn't he? By the way, this is the origin of Yad Vashem. A monument and a name in Hebrew is Yad Vashem. So if you are a eunuch, or if you are a non-Jew, in other words, if you're an outsider, and you think of there being no hope in your life, you think that you don't have a place here in the holy city, you will have a Yad Vashem. You will have a place and a name where? In my house and within my walls. Think about what that might mean when Isaiah says that. We think of the temple as a place where sacrifices are offered. It's a place that's only accessible to priests. But it seems to me Isaiah has a different conception about what the temple is. He says, those of you who think you don't belong, you will have a monument in my house and within my walls. To me, at least, that's an idea that's much more symbolic than it is realistic. It's not that God is going to write your name on the wall of the temple. It's that you have a place here. Jerusalem is the place where those who live lives of goodness and of righteousness belong. It's the city of goodness. The city where you belong if you have a life that is worthy in God's eyes. So you get a monument and a name better than my sons or my daughters. In other words, the ones who you think are on the inside, No, you're even better than them if you keep my Sabbaths and hold fast to my covenant. Go ahead, Sarah.
I will give them an everlasting name which shall not perish. As for the foreigners who attach themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it, and who hold fast to my covenant, I will bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer.
So just want to note a couple of things before this last verse. First of all, Isaiah says, not only are you here, you're here forever. Remember, part of what we've been talking about in this class is what survives on that mountain after the temple's destruction. We don't have a temple there anymore. It's just a bunch of rocks. What is it that lives beyond those rocks? So Maimonides says everything lives. God's presence is there. It will always be there. The Ravad, who argues with Maimonides, says there's nothing there. The temple's not there. It's just, it retains its historical significance, but there's no holiness there. Isaiah says, no. What will be there forever? What lives in that place forever? The names of those who live their lives in a good way. That's what Jerusalem must embody forever. What you think about sort of the best values of Judaism, the greatest values by which people live their lives. If you keep the Sabbath, you hold fast to my covenant. You are the ones who belong on my sacred mountain, and you, people, will be there forever, and you will rejoice in my house of prayer. So the other thing I want you to notice is Isaiah says nothing here about sacrifices. Remember Isaiah, this is the famous reading on Yom Kippur, right? The famous Haftorah reading on Yom Kippur, which is also Isaiah. He doesn't like sacrifices. He finds them ritualistic. People come with sacrifices, but they don't really have the proper intention that the sacrifices are supposed to stir up in people. They come to the mountain and they do what they have to do, but it's just an empty ritual for them. It's not real. So Isaiah says, who belongs on the mountain? It's not the ones who give the right sacrifices. It's the ones who hold fast to the covenant, and they can rejoice in my house of prayer. Now keep reading this last verse. This is famous from the High Holiday Liturgy. Sarah?
Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples.
So thank you. So we actually have this phrase written above our ark, and this gives you a bit of a context, right? My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. What does Jerusalem represent? It represents a city where there are no distinctions, where everyone is equal before God. As long as you live your life in a good way, nobody cares if you're a eunuch, nobody cares if you're a foreigner. You are loved in this place. You get your status for what you do, for how you live your life. Now note here this strange word, their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar. Now there is actually a debate in biblical scholarship about whether these words were original in the original text. Because if you think about it, they don't really belong. And because the verse before it says, let them rejoice in my house of prayer. And if you think about it, the words that should follow are, rejoice in my house of prayer, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples, right? And actually, very interesting, in the new conservative machzor, the Lev Shalem machzor, they remove the words, their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar. And part of the reason they do this is because there is critical biblical scholarship that says these words were added later on because of there should be, consistency. We don't want to make Isaiah appear as if he is opposed to the sacrificial service on the Temple Mount. And without those words, it would look like the Temple Mount is a shul, wouldn't it? Right? My house is a house of prayer. Rejoice in my house of prayer. It's a house of prayer for all peoples. Well, what do you mean? There's no prayer. There's rams and goats and stuff put on the altar. So you can make of that what you will. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I want to preserve, at least in Isaiah, this idea that Jerusalem's holiness comes from it being a city of justice where all are equal. There is no insider and outsider status in Jerusalem. And how ironic that idea is when we think about Jerusalem and all of its struggles today. Who owns this city? Well, Isaiah imagines it as a city without ownership, where it is owned by good people, no matter where they come from. This next source from Micah is another famous one that we'll need to just look at this because of Chaim Hershenson, who speaks next. Thus he will judge among the many peoples and arbitrate for the multitude of nations, however distant, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war, but every man shall sit under his grapevine or fig tree with no one to disturb him, for it was the Lord of hosts who spoke. Though all the peoples of the earth walk each in the name of its gods, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. Just review this source because we're going to need it for the next one. What is Micah saying? There will come a time where God will judge among the people, where there will be peace. And how is this envisioned? That all the people will walk in the name of their God. That is, Micah's vision is not that people lose their identities, just like Isaiah, right? Isaiah says, well, there's still such thing as a foreigner. It's just that in God's eyes, you're equal. Your national loyalty still exists. I'm not erasing them, but I don't make one more important than the other. So we walk in the name of our God. That's what Micah says. Other people walk in the name of their gods, but there's peace for everyone. And that is the idea that Jerusalem is not just a city of justice, but a city of peace. And the two are very much related, right? The peace and justice are related ideas. And with these two sources, we can look at the last source of today, which is Chaim Hershenson. Chaim Hershenson is a fascinating figure. He was born in 1857 and died in 1935. Prolific author, rabbi, thinker. What makes him really interesting is that he is one of the early proponents of religious Zionism and imagines in his book called Malki Bakodesh how a state of Israel might might act as a religious state. That is, what special laws might there be in a state of Israel? And he imagines all of these different roles that Jerusalem and Israel might play in the world. And some of his ideas are really amazing. I mean, when you think about what it means to be a light unto the nations, it's Chaim Hershenson who takes this idea to the extreme and says, by embodying the best in Jewish law, that's how a state of Israel will bring the world closer to a sense of peace and justice. So he takes these ideas of Jerusalem being a city of peace and justice, And that's really the source for him of Jerusalem's holiness, and puts it all together by connecting the concept of a city being a place of justice with the concept we had centuries ago of Jerusalem being a place of holiness, because it was a place where the temple stood and where the temple service was performed. So let me read this to you because the script isn't all that clear. Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, Malki Bakodesh. And from there all the sages of Israel shall teach the nation justice, law, and righteousness, and there shall stand chairs of justice of the great Beit Din in Yerushalayim. So what does he envision, Chaim Hershenson, in Jerusalem? That it will be a place where we teach justice, law, and righteousness. And since the city will be the center of justice, law, and righteousness, what do we need to revive? Not the temple, not sacrifices. The great Beit Din. You know, he must be referring to some modern version of the Sanhedrin, which used to sit in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin judged in matters of importance, sort of the Supreme Court. And he says, that's what we need to bring back to Jerusalem. It is Jerusalem's status as a city of justice, law, and righteousness that must first be revived in a modern state. From there shall come forth Torah and light to all the world, and this house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. So how does Chaim Hershenson imagine a modern Jerusalem being the light unto the nations? It is through its practice of justice. And he's now going to explain how that will make Jerusalem into a house of prayer for all nations. For there will not be present any image or symbol particular to a single nation in which another cannot believe. Now, this is fascinating. For Hershenson, the problem with supreme courts in all the other countries is that they are attached to a nation. They're attached to a country. When you go into a courthouse today in Canada or the United States, pretty much I'm guessing everywhere in the world, you will see on the wall the symbol of that country. And for Hershenson, that taints that court being able to manifest a true sense of divine justice, because it makes that justice dependent first on national identity and national loyalties. So he says, Jerusalem is going to be a house of justice and a house of prayer for all peoples. What do I mean that Jerusalem is a house of prayer for all peoples? It's going to have a court that is an international court, where there is no symbol of the menorah and the olive branch. For him, that symbol taints the ability of the court to execute justice fairly, because it makes it dependent on nationalism, on a national identity. And Hershenson says we need a place in the world where justice can be venerated as an independent ideal. And that's what Jerusalem ought to be. That is Jerusalem's holiness. That is what Isaiah was talking about when he said a house of prayer for all peoples. And what is the symbol of universal justice? He says, inside the ark will be only the 2 tablets of the covenant, That for him is the symbol of a justice that is not tied to a national identity. The Ten Commandments. Why? Because he says the Ten Commandments are the pillar of civilization for all the nations, and all the nations shall flow there, and many people shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, of the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways and walk in his paths. Ki mitzion teitzei Torah udvar Hashem b'Yerushalayim, for instruction shall come forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. They're not going up there to make sacrifices. They're not going up there to pray to rocks and stones. They are going up there to learn of the pillars of civilization, which are not objects, but they are ideals. They are ideals which flow from the Ten Commandments, which are not Jewish, they are universal. And then we will fulfill the prophecy. Ki mitzion teitzei Torah udvar Hashem b'Yerushalayim. This is the form that this house must take when we arrange there our government's organization. Notice house here. Ki beiti veit tefillah yikareh lechol ha'amim. His house, which we think means the temple, whenever it says my house, we think in our minds of the temple and sacrifices and priests and altars. For Hershenson, that's not the house that he envisions. It is a house, it's a courthouse. It's a Sanhedrin. It's a place where all the nations come to learn of justice and to make the world a more peaceful place. Further on, it is not far-fetched to think that this is the period of which Isaiah prophesied. The mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm on the mountains and tower above the hills, and to it shall flow the many peoples. And he made no mention of burnt offerings, meal offerings, or animal sacrifices. So he's saying Isaiah's preference for the Temple Mount, as I said earlier, was always that it be a place of good action, of morality, of justice, not a place where we were sacrificing animals. Okay, I only have 3 minutes, so I'll do this next part quickly. Before we will be informed of the location of the altar and we have a functioning high priest, the mount of the house of God will be standing atop the nations and will judge between the nations and will arbitrate for the many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. What does that mean according to Hershenson? The simple meaning is he will judge between the nations is connected to the mountain of the house of the Lord. Where is God doing this judgment between nations? Right there on that Temple Mount. Forget the high priest. We don't need a high priest. We need justice. The inevitable conclusion is that the Hall of Peace will be located in this house. It will not be the Hall of Peace as in The Hague, in which the delegates of peace bowed in awe before those who instill fear in the land of the living. That means The Hague, he's saying, can never work because of the respect that some nations command over others. And the slightest accusation of injustice leveled at one of the kings of the earth is considered rebellion, right? For him, The Hague has too many kings and monarchs that get too much respect. And it will be more than the League of Nations proposed by the father of national morality or the Wilson program. It will be the court of nations which will judge nations with righteousness, and the peoples of justice, and wickedness will no longer rule the world. And the idea that nationalism justifies wickedness and injustice will be voided, and there will be equality before the law for every nation, every man with the right to develop according to his nature without impairing the rights of his fellow man. And man will not rule over man, nor nation over nation, nor nation over man, nor man over nation. To their detriment, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and they shall no longer learn war. I could spend an hour just talking about this paragraph. I want to highlight before we say farewell until next week, just one core idea that I think Hershenson drives home in these last few sentences, which are actually sadly quite prophetic. Remember, he lives in 1935 and sees the rise of nationalism in many, many different places and countries that ends up being the cause for many more calamities that ensue in the 20th century. And he amazingly says, we need, nationalism can be, in an extreme form, the enemy of justice and righteousness. Nationalism pollutes the Hague and the League of Nations and the Wilson Program. They are all models of justice or houses of justice which are polluted too much by extremist nationalism here and there, and bad people get too much respect. And for Hershenson, religion is meant to be an antidote to extreme nationalism. Isn't that prophetic? He dies in 1935. The problem with nationalism for him is that you cannot have justice, a true justice, when there is us versus them. And he quotes those earlier sources from Isaiah. My house has got to be a house of prayer for all peoples. For Hershenson, that means Jerusalem must be international. This is before the existence of a modern state. This is before any discussion over Jerusalem and its status. But almost prophetically claims Jerusalem must be above nationalism. In order to dispense justice fairly, it cannot smell of any nationalism which by its nature pollutes the ability to transmit justice and create peace between peoples. Too much nationalism means religion is minimized. Religion is quashed. We need faith, a faith that views people as equal. You know, you can all say he's getting a little bit too caught up with his own ideas and he's being very naive. I accept that. I'm just here to present sources and to offer occasionally my comments, but I mostly do this to get you all thinking about what Hershenson is presenting. This profound idea, I think, that religion ought to be an antidote to nationalism, and Jerusalem is that religion. That's what Jerusalem represents. The place where Abraham and Melchizedek came together as equals. God didn't favor anybody. The case where the eunuch and the foreigner and the Jew are given an equal place in God's house. That's why Jerusalem is holy. Now, next week, this is going to get a little bit more political, because so far this sounds very beautiful, because we don't have a state of Israel yet in 1935. Now, next week, we're going to look at some modern ideas about the Temple Mount and how those have changed as a state has grown. And what we're supposed to do when we have a state of our own, which is a state that is based on a nationalistic principle, that is, that it is a state that belongs and is built for the Jewish people. And how we view the Temple Mount, therefore, as either a symbol of that statehood, a challenge to that statehood. And you'll see that people come at this from very, very different points of view. And I hope you'll stay with us next week for that final lesson. And I hope you found this to be challenging and interesting. So I'm going to stay on now for some after class discussion. You're welcome to leave. The class officially has ended. And I'm going to stop the recording as well for those who would feel more comfortable now turning on their screen after. Let me stop the recording.